Recording has started. This is Taylor Sharp, and welcome to the FileMaker Pro User Group Dallas chapter. Today is Friday, April 1st. April Fools to everybody, 2022. We're glad to have you. Greg Price and I are the chapter co-coordinators, and we're glad to have everybody here. And today, our presenter is Dennis Burnham, who has been a long-time member of our organization. Even when he moved up to Denver, we're still glad to keep in touch with him. He has some FileMaker templates and some shortcut things to show us today, and I'm looking forward to hearing about that. Dennis is an expert in user interfaces and a number of other things. We're glad to have him. So, Dennis, if you can take over. I'm not hearing you, Dennis.
You can hear me now.
Yes, I hear you now.
I was muting myself during your introduction. So let me just make this database a little bit larger for everybody. And I'm gonna bring up the opening script. Okay, so while you're looking at this thing, I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to what this is all about. First of all, I should tell you that I picked up this client in the most unusual way ever. This was about 2 or 3 years ago. I was working with a swimming pool company out in Fort Worth, and Taylor told me or introduced me to somebody on the east side of Dallas who was also doing work for swimming pools. And I went out to meet the guy because I wanted to learn from him and let him learn from me and see if we could learn from each other, so to speak. And as it happened, he told me that he was no longer doing work in FileMaker. He had taken a full-time position with one of his clients. So, you know, we had a chance to talk for about half an hour, 40 minutes. And just as I was getting ready to leave his living room and head to the front door to go home, his cell phone rang. And it was a call from somebody who had gotten his name off Google, and this guy wanted to have some FileMaker work done. So he handed the phone to me and said, you know, here might be a client for you. So it turned out that the guy calling in was located just a few miles away. So we met at a gas station, believe it or not. And I think this was shortly after the beginning of the pandemic, I'm not sure. But anyway, I remember sitting in the front seat of his car, selling him on what FileMaker could do. And he's a very gregarious kind of personality. And he was explaining to me that what he does is he creates signage for hospitals. And at that point, I knew very little about the business of doing signage. But he was explaining it to me as somebody might do in the front seat of their car, which, you know, had its limitations, of course. And he told me that the way he creates his invoicing now, or then I should say, was in Adobe Illustrator. And you might wonder, why would somebody do invoicing in Adobe Illustrator? And turns out the reason was that that's the only software program he knew how to use. He used Adobe Illustrator to make the hospital signs. So obviously, if you can use Adobe Illustrator for hospital signs, why not use it for invoicing? Well, there are lots of reasons why not to use Adobe Illustrator for invoicing. First of all, it doesn't have any math built into it. So whatever you type on the thing could very well be wrong. And there was also no systematic way of linking together um, invoices for a particular client. You know, if you were working in FileMaker, the invoice might have a client ID number, and if you did a find for that, you would gather up all of their invoices. But in his case, he was sharing his desktop with Dropbox so that his daughter, who works with him, would also have access to the hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of Adobe Illustrator files. I'll just go over here and open up one of them to show you what I'm talking about. If I open this file with Adobe Illustrator, you'll see what I mean. Now, for today's meeting, I've followed the Joe Friday rule of changing the names to protect the innocent. So here is an invoice. And if I use the Adobe Illustrator toolbox, you know, I can make it a little bigger so that you can see it better. So, you know, he had his logo at the top, and he created an invoice number with no systematic rhyme or reason, by the way. So as I began to work with him, I found out that there were lots of invoices that had the same invoice number, even though they weren't the same invoice. And then he had this little grid. Now, he explained to me that this grid that you're looking at is the standard for the architectural industry. You know, I immediately took issue with the fact that you don't take numbers and make them left justified. That's just goofy. But anyway, that was just a design element. I couldn't tell you today whether he's telling me the truth or not, that this is a standard in the architectural industry. But the thing that we're going to be discussing today is the fact that when he renders an invoice for a project, and the project has been previously invoiced, for some reason, as you can see in this column called previous invoice amount, there's a requirement that the architectural industry needs to know what was previously billed, not in total, but what were they billed on the most recent previous invoice. So anytime you're creating an invoice, you have to reference back to whatever you did in the previous period. It might be the previous month, it might be the previous quarter, doesn't matter, as long as it's the most recent one. And then there's this column called total earned, which they use to compare against the total fee that they've agreed to pay for that element in the invoice. So in this case, in the first line, nothing has been earned yet on the $25,000. But if you look at the third line, they are 20% of the way toward the $150,000 total. And then the column on the right shows what they're expecting the person to pay on that particular invoice. So my job was to kind of recreate that in FileMaker. So the first thing I'll show you is I'll go to the layout for the invoice and put it in layout mode. And if I go to this graphic at the bottom and hide all other objects, you can see that what I did was I put down at the very base layer of the layout, one of his invoices where I have the grid, but I don't have any of the numbers. I just have elements that I can use so that I can then place the FileMaker objects where they belong. So one of the objects, of course, was a portal. I'm not sure if I can find the portal, but you can see it in gray right there. So let's see if I can hide all other objects. So now you see a typical FileMaker portal with some vertical lines that were drawn over it. And of course, the horizontal lines are easy to configure in your inspector. And little by little, I went ahead and made the invoice layout in FileMaker one that could be used month after month or quarter after quarter for whatever he was going to invoice. When it started, there were only 5 portal rows. But as it happens, I'm sure with you and lots of other clients, you get into a relationship and all of a sudden they say, oh, well, now we have to do 6 rows. And I say, but you told me it would never be more than 5. So, you know, the layout had to get revised. So if I go back now to the home layout, I'll begin to show you what this thing does. So we start out with a toolbar to let him look at his clients, his projects, his invoices. And then there's another kind of billing that he does for expense reporting. And then I gave him settings. So I'm going to go to the settings first, just to show you that this is a table that I call globals. It only has one record in it. And this is where he can put in his basic information. So, you know, Taylor, you'll recognize this is your address and your phone number. I decided you are the principal owner of Humanity Natural Wayfinding, the fictitious company that we're going to be using for today's example. So the staff members of the company are in this portal. And if you want to look at them close up, you can do that. And you can change their email addresses or their phone numbers or their titles or whatever. I've got a standard message that is used whenever an invoice is sent out. It's keeping track of whatever is the next invoice number and the next expense report. I'm giving him the ability to format his phone numbers by default with either dots or hyphens or parentheses. For the mapping, I'm using my API key from Google. I have a thing called window position so that anytime a window opens, it'll either stay where it belongs or it'll just go dead center in the screen of whatever computer you're on. This is the graphic that goes at the top of his documents. His invoice terms are 90 days, and that's used for calculating when the invoice is due. Some of his clients have various billing locations, so he's able to send the invoice to different locations based upon, I suppose, whoever is giving him the job to do. He's got some expense categories. He can make as many as he needs for his expense reporting. He's got 2 hourly rates, one for his assistant, one for the people who make the signs. And this is a portal down here in the corner of the signs themselves. I've been working with him for 2 years, and so far we haven't yet gotten his daughter to start putting PDF images or JPEG images of the signs in the database. She's using FileMaker, but unfortunately she doesn't get it. So she makes a new FileMaker database for each hospital that they're working with, and there's no consistency, and I haven't been able to standardize that for him. Now this one in the middle I've left for last. This is a real important one. There are these kinds of services. So he's got basically 4 kinds of services that he can use to automatically populate an invoice. And in the example I'm going to give you today, we're using the second one, design, drawing, and wayfinding. If I show you this other one, you'll see that it's got a different set of services. And these represent the line items that would go on any particular invoice that, or it'll be the project that I show you first. You can make custom ones too, but they're a little bit hard to tell them apart from one another. So we don't really work with that as much. So if I go to the clients, you'll see there are 4 clients in this system. By the way, Taylor or anybody else, if I'm going too fast, you know, just turn your microphone on and slow me down. Or
you're doing fine. Just you should have used Taylor Swift's picture instead of mine.
Yeah. Well, you know, Taylor, I did put your assistant in there because I knew that you want to have her sitting beside you whenever you do your work.
Oh, there we go. Cameron always works.
So, all right, so we've got 4 clients in the system, and basically these are architectural firms who work with hospitals, and my client is hired by them as an outsource strictly for the signage that goes in the hospitals. The example I'm going to show you today, just for make believe, I'm using a hotel, just as an example to show that the same kind of system, if it's true that this format works for the architectural industry. Somebody who does signage doesn't have to focus just on hospitals. They could work with hotels as well. And he did show me at one point the kind of architectural drawings that they have to work with in order to decide where the signs go and what size they're supposed to be and whether they have to include Braille. It's very, very detailed when you're looking at an architectural blueprint for, let's say, a 10-story building that has all the different hallways and things that you're familiar with if you walk into any hospital. So it could work for a hotel, or it could work for a school, it could work for any kind of it could work for an airport, any place that needs a lot of signage to get people going to the right place. So in this case, this Westervelt Foundation has 3 projects going. One for the Wilson Outpatient Clinic, one for a Graceland Hospital, and the one we're going to work with today is for the Dallas Omni Hotel. Here in the lower right corner, he's got portals to show all the previous invoices that have been sent. And in this case, there are no expense reports, but they could be there. And the rest of it is all his demographic information and the names of the contact people working at either of the offices. So if I jump over to the Dallas Omni Hotel project, now I'm on my project layout. And if I choose this Westervelt Foundation, there are the 3 projects. So the one we're working with being the Dallas Omni Hotel, the project has a project number. And here we indicate its location and whose attention the invoice should go to, what's the PO number. He can assign the project to as many as 3 different people in his organization to do different things that are necessary. And the important thing now is that there's a fee total. In other words, they've agreed on a total fee of $160,000 for doing the signage for the Dallas Omni Hotel. And he can also put in an estimate of his travel expenses. Now, I should mention about travel that when this thing began, there was no pandemic. And about 2 weeks into the project, he stopped traveling. So at that point, there's no more need to send out expense reports for travel costs because he didn't have any. So we've got a fictitious due date of the end of June for when this project should be completed. If it is complete, he can indicate it that way and comments so that he can give a description of it. And again, here's this service group that we've chosen. And what we've put in are the dollar amounts for each of these 4 elements that are going to be invoiced every single month. So if I were to modify any of these numbers, let's say that I don't want the signage review to be 46%, but I want it to only be 45%. What happens is it recalculates the fee, and I now get a warning telling me that it doesn't total up properly to $160,000. So I can either put it back to what it was, or I can increase something else. So let's say I make this one 25%. Well, now I'm a little bit closer. I'm still $500 short. So here I can put in 500 additional dollars on those floors, and now it totals up to 100%. You may think this is insignificant, but I'm telling you that my client can't do math. So this is really critical for him. There are script triggers on each of these fields, the fee and the percentage, so that whatever he puts in automatically adjusts the opposite number. So for instance, if I was to take 11.6 and put in the number 12, I'd get some bogus stuff because you got to put in the decimal for 12 in order to make it work. But if I go back to .116, I'm a little bit too much on that. So 18,500, was that what it was? All right, now I'm at 100% again. So what I've done is I've constructed a project that's going to be used month after month for invoicing. Now there's already one invoice that was made for this for the December period. So we'll begin by looking at that one. So we now jump to the invoice layout, where I've got the opportunity to choose my project. So if I choose the Dallas Omni Hotel, there is the one and only invoice that's ever been done for that client. And you can see that in December, 40% of the first line item was completed. So the previous invoice is zero because he never did anything prior to December. And $7,200 is 40% of 18,000. So this invoice has a $7,200 amount for that. And likewise for each of the others. So it's very simple for him to go down this list of 4 things and recall either from actual work he's done or whatever he feels like billing them for the period as these numbers increase month by month from 0 toward 100. If I delete the PDF that's in there and click this create button, it asks if I want to hide or show the travel expenses, because in some months he wants to show the travel costs. So if I click show, when the PDF is made, there's a travel expense number that appears at the bottom. So he gets to look at the fact that there's an invoice which he can then send by email, or if he clicks this blue button, it'll open it up in Adobe Acrobat so that he can look at it larger, I suppose, or maybe he wants to save it to someplace on his desktop. I know he does that a lot because he doesn't trust FileMaker, so he still keeps saving these somewhere and putting them into Dropbox. So now let's do a pretend session of, we're now at the end of January and we want to bill for the progress that's been made for the next month. So when I choose this button in the corner for new invoice, I'm given an option to either bill for the project fees or hourly line items. This is another thing that developed about 6 months into the project, where he said, sometimes we've got to make invoices for whatever my daughter does on an hourly basis. So we have that opportunity too. So I'm going to put in as a start date for this period, January 1st of 2022 and January 31st of 2022, 22. And I'll choose the client and I'll choose the project, and automatically I'm getting the previous invoice so I can have a look at it. I didn't want to do it this way, but this is what he wanted. He wanted to see the previous one before he goes any further. But I've got my new invoice created with the invoice number 1158. So if I switch to that, you can see that there are no line items in it at all. But there's this blue button which says Get Line Items. And when he clicks that button, what happens is it opens up a scratch area where he can look at whatever was done in the previous month in case he's forgotten what he looked at. And here he can adjust what he wants it to be. So let's say that for the first line item, it's going to go up from 40 to 55%. And this one, let's take it up to 30%. And the next one, let's say there's 5% done on that. We'll leave the last one at 0. He can click this undo button if he doesn't like what he's looking at. I'm going to accept it. And so now these new fees show me that on the previous invoice, this emergency shelf floors was $7,200. Because I'm billing for $2,700 now, I have a total of $9,900. So I can create the PDF for that and then send it out. My mistake was, and I made this mistake deliberately, today is April 1st, and the invoice really shouldn't be dated April 1st. So we'll go back and make it January 31st. And that changes the due date to May 1st. So I can delete the PDF and make it again, and it's easy to correct before it gets sent out to somebody. And then if I want to make another invoice, because now let's say he didn't do any billing in February, but it's now the end of March. And just to make this a relevant example, we'll pretend that he's completed the project. So this period started on February 1st, 2022, and it ended yesterday on March 31st of 2022. And again, I'm going to choose the Westervelt Foundation and the Dallas Omni Hotel. And I'll go to the current one that we're building and get the line items. And now I'm going to take this one up to 100%. And we'll take this one up to 100%. And we'll take this one up to 100%. And we'll take this one up to 95, just to leave a little bit undone. And when I click accept, I now have an invoice for $135,625. And the project is not yet complete, but it's very close. So that is the demonstration of what this thing does. If I were to change the hourly line items, I'm going to get a warning that what's going to happen is if I change this to an hourly invoice, these line items will get deleted. So just in case he clicked that accidentally, I'm aborting that.
I have a question.
Yeah, I'm ready.
How do you like to handle taxes? Do you like to make those line items or a tax for the whole invoice? Keep it in mind that some things that aren't always taxed at the same rate.
Right. Well, if I were doing taxes and some line items are taxable and others are not, I would be calculating the tax on each line item, even if I wasn't showing it. I would be calculating it and then drawing a total at the bottom. This particular customer of mine doesn't have freight or sales tax that would appear below a subtotal. But generally, what I do is count it, unless the tax is applicable to the whole invoice, I would calculate it on each line item.
Yeah, I have clients that say it is, and then you find out down the road it isn't always.
Right. Well, you'll find that if the items that you're putting in a line item portal come from a table of products, that's where you can do the original calculation of whether or not that product or that service is taxable or not. So that if it is taxable, there'll be a non-zero number in the portal for that line item.
Yeah, see, there's a lot. You have to look at the products to see if it's a taxable product, but then you also have to look at the customer to see if it's a taxable customer, like a church or something. So that's also a pain in the butt too.
Right, and you also have to look at the state that something is being shipped to, because if it's being shipped out of state, it's not going to be a taxable invoice. If it's shipped within the state, then you have to know what the tax rate is. And in some cases, you have to build a table of counties because each county may have a different sales tax rate.
FYI, the new Wayfair Supreme Court settlement says that states and other taxes can require you to collect sales tax when you're shipping out of state now, which is becoming a real pain in the butt sales tax wise.
You can also use a third party. You can also use with an API, use a third party to do your sales tax.
I like to use Avalara's API because it's free for figuring out tax rates. Now they also offer helping with reporting and stuff too, but yeah.
And your customers can choose whether or not to upload their client information up to it and store that long term, get the results out of that as well.
Heather, when you say somebody will do the billing of the sales tax, do you mean that you?
No, I don't mean the billing. I mean the calculating of the tax. We'll return the correct tax based on the address.
Got it.
Based on geocode.
They say they will do that. I've used them, and when you are evaluating products and when they are taxed and not, it actually Avalara can get real complicated, and it really a lot boils down to you coding everything right up front.
Yeah,
I don't remember the name of the service that we used before. We had a client that has franchises nationwide, and so the taxes had to be calculated based on, the installation. It was a sign company, and basically it had to be based on where the franchisee was located and where the installation occurred. And so it was all geocoded addresses, and to calculate the correct state taxes so that the corporate franchisor was paying the right amount of tax to each of the 50 states. And so, but this was not a free service that was used. We tied into an API with there were a certain number of calls that were free, but after 1,000 calls or something like that, then they paid 5 cents or something like that per address call.
Yeah, and that stuff
rates.
is changing. For example, California now has, you don't have to collect sales tax if you make sales in California, out-of-state sales to them for under $250,000. But if you go over it, then you have to. And so sometimes the tricky thing is when you're saying, should I charge someone sales tax? And it depends on whether or not you're going to do $250,000 in sales in the state, and you don't know that in January. Do you charge the sales tax or not? Or do you collect it, and then if you collect it, if you don't send it to the state, do you have to refund it? And it's just a pain in the butt.
One other thing
Yeah.
I didn't mention before is that this particular client of mine would call me on the phone typically and complain that his customers claim they owe him a certain amount of money, and he thinks that they're wrong. It took me about a year to persuade him that when he gets paid, he should put the payment in the system so that, let's say somebody paid $35,000 and he got a check for that amount, then obviously it will reduce the balance due and he'll have something accurate that he can show them. I also gave him the ability to make a statement so he can actually show the customer month by month what they were billed and what they were paid. You and I know that this is a real easy thing, but for somebody who's been doing his invoicing in Adobe Illustrator, believe me, this was a revelation to him.
One of the things I have to do for clients a lot of times is someone will pay an invoice, but they don't pay the exact amount, and then the company accepts it and closes it anyway. So one of the things is sometimes what they pay doesn't match what the invoice amount is, but you still want to be able to close and say, yes, this is paid or done with, even though it was over or under whatever you expected them to pay.
Back in 2006, I think, or 7, I was working with a company in Dallas called Gigantic Color. They were sold a few years later. And in FileMaker, in those days, I think we were still working with FileMaker version 10 or 11. Typically, what happens is a good company will give you a check with a payment stub attached to it that tells you what invoices they're paying. And you can go invoice by invoice and apply those amounts. And in most cases, they do match up. But sometimes somebody will just handwrite a check for an amount and not tell you what they're paying. And so what I did for that company long ago, and this was before we had tools like JSON, I created a script that would bring up all of the open invoices in descending order by date. Maybe it was ascending order by date. So what they could do is click a button beside each of those invoices, pay off the oldest one first, and it might leave a remainder on the most recent one, or they might get lucky if they're able to pick and choose which ones they want to apply the money to in order to have no remainder left over, because they're able to do the math in their head and they can see what the customer was intending to pay. Maybe they skipped one because of a dispute. But that kind of a user interface is very easy to build these days. And it handles the situations where somebody will just handwrite a check and not tell you what invoices they're paying. And of course, this particular customer is not using my credit card processing, but if they were, and they were to just click a button to charge the amount of this invoice to somebody's credit card, it would automatically create this payment record in the related table of payments. So it would be a lot easier, but he is just taking checks at this point. So if nobody has more questions about this, I'm going to jump into my second topic for you. All right, so here we go. So this is an application or a database that I found online in the Claris community when it wasn't called Claris a few years back. And it was called the iOS App Maker. It's real hard to find these days. So what I'm going to do after today's session is post it in Taylor's website so that in Taylor's database, so that anybody who wants to download it and use it can do so. It requires the base elements plugin. So in the on OpenScript, if the plugin wasn't there, it would require, the script is called the plugin checker. It would notify you that it needs the base element plugin to work. And what this thing does is it builds a file whose type is mobile config. Right? The extension is .mobile config. And when you send that file as an attachment and the email is opened on an iOS device, it then installs. And so what I'll do for a second is show you my iPad. And if I go back to the home screen, you can see that there's this icon on my desktop of on my home screen of my iPad. And it was made from this application, this database that's called iOS App Maker. And if I tap it with my finger, it will bring up FileMaker Go and go right into opening the file. So if you'll let me just tap with my fingers on my iPad. And then it will open up the database. But in this case, I must have typed something wrong. So we'll go back to it later on. So what I'm going to do here is use this to make an opener for the database we were just looking at. So the first thing I do is I click a button to create a new profile. And I'm going to give the profile the name HNW. And we'll call it an opener for the HNW database. And the home screen name, we'll make it just real simple, HNW, and HNW.FMP12 is the database name, and it's on a server, so we call it remote. And the server is my Linux server. So I put in the server name, and then I can put an icon in. So I'm going to just drag this little JPEG. And because this thing was created before they stopped using this glass effect in iOS, by default, it adds this glass effect. But if you uncheck it and click the save button, it kind of goes away. So what I've done to modify it, and I'll leave it modified this way for you, is I have a place to put in the client's email so that I can email it to the client, but I sometimes like to email it to myself first to check it. So if I put in my email address and click email to me, and then I'll go back to QuickTime Player so you'll see my iPad and open up my email. There is the email that came in. So what I've done is I've written the message that tells somebody what to do. Now the directions probably need to change because, or actually I have changed them already. It used to be that you would just tap this thing and it would bring up in iOS the standard Apple dialog for installing a profile. It doesn't do that now. Now what it does is it downloads the thing, but then you have to go to the settings to install it. So I'll do that. I'll tap on it and it tells me that it's been downloaded. And then I'll go to my settings And you can see right underneath this thing for the Apple Arcade, it tells me that there's been a profile downloaded. So when I tap that, it shows me the profile. It tells me that it's not signed. I really don't care about signing. Maybe there's a way to learn how to sign the thing. I don't care. I just want to make it work. So I click the install button at the top, and it wants my password for my iPad. And now it tells me again the profile is not signed, but I just go ahead and install it. And now tap done. So if I go back out to my desktop, there is the HNW opener that we've made. So if I tap that, it will ask me to log in. This time, let's see if I can do it without making a mistake. So now we're in the same application that I was showing you before, except now we're looking at it in iOS instead of in FileMaker Pro. So the point of doing this is that when you're working with people who don't understand how to use FileMaker Go, which I think is 100% of the human population in North America, they just don't get it. This makes it much simpler. You're giving them something that installs either on their phone or their iPad. In the settings, there's only one thing you have to do, and that's put in your SMTP settings for it to use the built-in server. I guess the difference between iOS 6 and 5 is out of date these days, but it doesn't matter. In the About tab, there's a description of who made it and where it came from, but you won't find it on the community anymore. If it is, I haven't been able to find it there. It's just obsolete, but it works beautifully. So, any questions about that? Well, then we're done for today, Taylor.
Now you said you're going to make this available. Where will we find something?
Yeah, the one that you're looking at, I will remove the my name and password from the security and just let it open up with the standard admin full access password, and you can create as many profiles as you want. In this one right now, there are two. There's the first one that was in there before I started for the Kin Furniture Company, and there's the new one we just made. And by the way, if your solution somehow needs to have more than one database, you could just add as many related databases as necessary, and they all get factored into the creation of the profile. The profile is, let me see if I can open it in BB Edit so you can see what it looks like. It's basically an XML file, I think.
I think most of that is the image, the icon image.
Everything that you see at the beginning of it here is the icon. And then the text that you entered in the various fields goes into this section at the bottom. So typically what I do when there's a company that has 10 employees, I just send the same thing to each of them, and let me look at it in my email again because it came in a little while ago.
So it's creating a shortcut then from the file
in capital letters that you must open this on your iOS device, because if you try to install it on a Mac or a Windows machine, it won't do anything at all. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
Jacob, did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Actually,
I'm curious to see what the what the
what I
code is
did-
actually doing behind the scenes from the script.
What I did,
Oh, go ahead.
what I didn't say when I was answering you, Jacob, is you'll need to, and Taylor will show you how to connect to the FMPUG database so that when you're logged into that, you can see a list of all of the monthly meetings, and some of them have video links to see the recording, and some of them have objects that you can download, and that's what this will be. I'll put it up there this afternoon.
It's all on fmpugdallas.com. So www.fmpugdallas.com. So the database, and the videos are down at the bottom. It's all right there. And Jacob, you're already in the database, so you'll be able to get a two-factor confirmation of who you are, so get credentials to log into that.
Hey, Taylor,
Okay.
Taylor, why don't you put that in a chat for Jacob, because the noise around you makes it impossible to hear what you were saying.
I assume this is recorded like all the others, right?
Say that again?
Yes,
I
it is
assume
recorded.
this is recorded. Yeah, good.
Yes.
Okay, because I came in late, and right after I started watching you, I was given the word that it's time to move to my new office. So apologies for the distraction of my background, but
I was watching you around there for a while. You know, you came for a few minutes late. You didn't hear us talk about Taylor playing an April Fool's joke on the world by not sending out an invitation today.
you know, I looked in my email for it and I couldn't find it, and I thought that's so unlike him. So I just went to the web page and figured it out. But I was still late regardless.
Well, that's all right. It's good to see you. And
Likewise,
happy April
likewise. Happy April Fools, everyone. Hey, actually, I want to ask you about something totally unrelated, Dennis. I want to know how you created those squares on your desktop back there.
Oh,
That organization. I
Yeah.
really like that.
I do too.
How did you do
I'll show you just a second. It's really, really simple. I have a folder here called Desktop Backgrounds. And
Okay.
if I open these three with Quick Look, it's just a JPEG that has the size of my.
Oh, got it. And then you just made that your background. Okay.
And the reason why I have three different colors of the same thing is because sometimes I use that, what do they call that thing in the system preferences?
Oh, the night shift.
Mission
or something
control.
like that.
Mission control.
Yeah.
So when I use mission control to go
Oh yeah, to shift screens.
like that to another desktop,
Yeah, yeah. Mhm.
it has a different color. It's a good reminder to me of what I'm doing.
I like that.
Because it's April Fool's Day, I'll show you this other one that I made. I had to do something for somebody who was appearing in court for a deposition during the pandemic on Zoom. So I made this background.
Very good. Nice, nice.
But yeah,
All
it's
right.
the only problem with the background is if you change your resolution, then everything doesn't go into the little rectangles. And you know, I just find it convenient to move things around as a simple reminder of, you know, what I'm supposed to be working on.
Right. No, I like it. I like it.
There was a New York Times article about 30 years ago when people started using computers. And the author of the article was trying to calculate the amount of time we waste doing something that he called futzing, which is moving things around on your desktop that accomplishes nothing at all. But there are people who, you know, they want their desktop to be like organized in a certain way.
Yep. Yep.
So you
Well,
just need somebody who can make you a JPEG file in Photoshop, and you can make the rectangles whatever you want them to be, and you know, the little titles whatever you want them to be. It's really easy.
I like it a lot. All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Taylor, you want to stop the recording? I don't know if he hears me.
Looks like he's lost in conversation. I appreciate that resource though. I found it on the FMPUG website. I'm actually in the solution right now. So I'll check it out, and this might actually be something that I can use. So I appreciate it.
If you're logged into that thing, then in the future, if Taylor doesn't screw up again, you'll get an invitation.
Oof.
I'll work on that. Apologies, everybody.
I'm not going to let him off the hook for that for at least a year.
Yeah, as I said before, at least he's not Will Smith.
Right. If I could slap you virtually, I would, but I can't.
Okay, without further ado, I think we're going to wrap things up. I'm going to stop the recording here. So 1, 2, 3, here, stop the recording.